I'm Bill Hemmer. This is Hemmer Time. With me today, Jonathan Turley. Thank you, sir, for being here, and good day.
Thank you.
George Washington School of Law, a friend of Fox News, an amazing mind, by the way. You have a way of taking complicated stuff and making it understandable. That's a talent.
Thank you for that. I appreciate it.
I don't know why you're a Chicago Bears fan, but we shall discuss that on another time.
It's because I'm morally perfect when it comes to football.
I see. Well, I'm a Cincinnati Bengal fan. What does that make me?
That will take an entire show.
I'm sorry. Yes, it would. Listen, on Super Bowl weekend, I thought I'd mention that. Let's see how the big game comes out. To our listeners, just so they're aware, we are recording this on Thursday afternoon. So things could change between now and over the weekend. Let's see how that goes. But I pulled a piece that you wrote on the 17th of January. You said a lot in here, but here's one key line. A trial with an empty defense table would magnify the view of many that this is an improper or, at a minimum, unnecessary exercise. So you're recommending to the Trump team, don't show up. Is that right?
I am indeed. Their best possible defense would be no defense. That's what happened in the first attempt at a retroactive trial. There's only been two. One involved the former senator from Tennessee, William Blount. The other one involved later the former Secretary of War, William Belknap. What's interesting about Blount is that when he was brought before the Senate, many of the Constitution's signers were still alive. Many were in Congress, including Blount himself, who was a signer of the Constitution. And Blount refused to appear and said that the entire trial of a former official was flagrantly unconstitutional. The Senate went ahead and dismissed the case. In the second attempt, it barely survived that threshold vote. Almost half of the Senate wanted to dismiss that case, just as they did the Blount case. But it fell short of 50%, but not surprisingly, they then easily acquitted him. So the record itself is quite limited. There are good faith arguments on both sides. But for Trump, I think the best defense would be not to show up and the contest the validity of the trial.
His lawyers, David Schoen and Bruce Castor, at the moment, I believe they will be there on Tuesday. Do you have reason to think otherwise?
No, I don't. This is really a question for the Senate as an institution, as opposed to the Trump team. There are not just constitutional, but prudential questions. Putting aside the question of the Constitution, which 45 senators indicated that they likely share that view. But there's also a prudential problem. This is the first snap impeachment in history. This arrived at the Senate with literally no record of a hearing, an investigation, even an opportunity for the president to respond. That has never happened. It breaks from tradition. While a record isn't required, there's always been some record. I have talked to senators who are not comfortable in legitimating that type of process.
Democrats?
I've actually talked to one Democrat who had the same misgivings, but I'm not too sure that will be the deciding factor. But the question for these senators is whether they want to effectively create this precedent. You know, the position of the House is that the president can be removed at any time, 2 hours, 2 days, 2 years, 20 years after he leaves office. If that's the case, why wouldn't they have created a record since it was clear he would not be tried while he was in office? I wrote a column to that effect and noted that weeks have gone by, weeks, and the House has not tried to put any witness relevant to the question of Trump's intent under oath. You know, there are two houses of Congress. They control one of them. They could have been calling, referred to 10 witnesses who are clearly willing to testify because they've spoken publicly. Not one of them has been called before the House to lock in that testimony, to make it part of the public record.
Let's answer your question. Why haven't they?
Well, I don't know. One answer may be that, lawyers don't ask questions they don't know answers to. The record on Trump's intent is actually mixed, much like his speech itself. Many of us criticized his speech. I criticized his speech when he was giving it. And many of us criticized his slow response. But what has trickled out really plays to both sides. For example, the acting Secretary of Defense said that Trump told him that you should have 10,000 troops ready because you're going to need it. This was before the speech. Well, that cuts both ways. That indicates that Trump is saying, you better be prepared. It also does not show that Trump gave an order to be prepared. There's a lot of those questions that aren't answered. The question is, why wouldn't the House want to answer them? Much of this material and information is in the possession or available to the House.
Let's talk about what we think we know. House managers have filed a brief. It's 80 pages long. The president's response is 14 pages long. Start with the managers of the House. What did you learn from that? Well,
the most glaring aspect of the House managers' brief is the lack of interest in proving intent. The House may be the victim of its own excess. It decided not to hold a hearing where we could have looked at the language of the article and possibly written an article that could garner broader support. Instead, they muscled through an article that they wanted to say incitement to insurrection. Well, that's the deepest hole you can possibly dig to fill at a trial. And the key there will be intent. Did Trump really intend an actual insurrection, an actual rebellion? Now, you would think that they would be loading up to try to prove that intent because you cannot convict him without that intent. Well, instead, the brief really sounds like they're trying to impeach him for negligence, right? They talk about how people interpreted his words, as opposed to how they were intended. But that's not the question in the article of impeachment. They wrote the article to say that he was intending to actually cause a rebellion, to actually cause an insurrection. And yet this brief says very little about it. In fact, it barely mentions Trump's countervailing statements, where he said, go and do this peacefully. And when they get to his 2:30 or so tweet, where he says, obey law enforcement, support law and order, and eventually he said, go home, they just basically sort of shrug that off as, well, he really didn't mean it. Well, you can't have a conviction where you just invite everyone to speculate on meaning when there's witnesses who could have been called over the last few weeks that could shed light on that meaning.
Very interesting. I think the line was from that day something similar to, now we're going to walk to the Capitol peacefully and patriotically. I imagine that will come up a lot.
Yeah, and what will also come up is similar language being used by the Democrats. It's very common for people to march on state and federal capitals to protest what's going on inside. There's nothing that's an insurrection about that. And so the question is going to be, how do you prove that he was actually trying to incite a rebellion when he's telling them to do this peacefully? There also will play back the words of Democratic members who have used similar language, reckless language, frankly, through the years. Some of them refuse to acknowledge the legitimacy of Trump's election in 2016 and use this type of language when there were violent riots going on in Washington, D.C. So if you're going to create this type of vicarious liability, you better be awfully careful.
The House managers are expected to also pull a number of videos. Maybe you saw them online. Maybe they were shot by some of the protesters and rioters themselves. I imagine, Jonathan, that will likely be the most powerful part of the entire week. Would you agree?
Yes, I think the House is developing an emotionally strong case, but it's disconnected from the elements to prove. They don't seem to be trying to win the trial. They seem to be trying to stage this trial to have its biggest emotive impact. Having all those people saying, well, I thought I was invited, I was doing what Trump told me to do, simply refers to how his words were received, not how they were intended. And they don't seem to be making any serious effort to answer the question of intent, which is absolutely necessary to, in my view.
For the full podcast, go to foxnewspodcast.com.